In every county across rural America, there exists a quiet ledger of knowledge that was held by women who never spoke much, who never wrote letters to the editor, who never appeared in the photographs of the agricultural fair committees, and whose names appear only in the small black ink of family Bible fly-leaves and the brittle paper of district birth records. The plain settlements of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and the lesser-known Amish belts of Iowa and Missouri preserved within them a parallel agriculture, a parallel domestic science, and a parallel cooling chemistry that survived 4 generations of American industrial transformation by the simple expedient of being too unremarkable to be written down. By the late 1960s, the rest of rural America had given over its butter-making to the centralized creamery, its cooling to the electric Frigidaire, its testing to the county dairy inspector with his butyrate meter and his federally calibrated lactometer, and its cream cultures to the standardized starter packets shipped in dry ice from the laboratory of the Pennsylvania State University Department of Dairy Science at University Park. The old order Amish settlements of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where this story begins, sat in a peculiar and complicated middle position by the early 1970s, with the more liberal districts permitting limited compressor-driven cooling tanks for milk destined for the English market, and the stricter districts maintaining the old prohibition against owning or operating electrical apparatus on the home farmstead. The 8 original districts of southern Lancaster County, those organized along the Old Mill Road between Bird in Hand and Strasburg, held to the older standard with the deliberate stubbornness that the chroniclers of plain agriculture have always found difficult to translate for outside readers. And it was within those 8 districts on the morning of October 14, 1971, that a young widow named Rebecca Stoltzfus, then 36 years of age, walked the 4½ miles from her own farmstead on Cherry Hill Lane to the farmstead of an elderly brown Swiss breeder in northern Lebanon County to begin a small experiment in cooling chemistry that the men at the Lebanon County Dairy Cooperative would laugh about for the better part of 7 years, and that the judges of the 1978 Pennsylvania Farm Show Dairy Products Exhibition would, on the 17th of January, in the Great Hall of the Pennsylvania State Farm Show Complex at Harrisburg, award the gold medal for the finest farmstead cultured butter produced in the entire Commonwealth of Pennsylvania during the calendar year 1977. The brown Swiss cow had not been the dairy animal of choice in Lancaster County since the great Holstein consolidation of 1947, when the cooperative bulk pickup system established by the Lancaster County Dairy Producers Federation had standardized the contracted milk solids ratio at 3.4% butterfat and 8.7% solids not fat, a calibration that favored the high-volume, low-solids output of the Holstein Friesian, and that gradually pushed every smaller brown Swiss herd, every working milking shorthorn line, and every remaining Guernsey holdout in the county into either dispersal at the Bart Livestock Auction or into the small back pastures of the most conservative old order Amish farms, where the bulk pickup contract had never been signed in the first place. The bulk pickup system depended on refrigerated steel tanks on a 60,000 British thermal unit compressor unit, cooling the milk from milking temperature to 38 degrees Fahrenheit within 4 hours on a daily diesel-powered pickup truck, routed by the cooperative dispatcher out of the central creamery at Mannheim, and on the strict rejection of any milk arriving at the central creamery at temperatures above 42 degrees. By 1965, the bulk pickup contract had become so dominant in Lancaster County that the more liberal Amish bishops, sitting in their semi-annual district councils, had begun to issue Ordnung modifications, permitting the placement of compressor units in detached milk houses, provided that the electricity drove only the cooling apparatus and was generated by a diesel engine and not drawn from the public utility grid. 8 districts in the southern part of Lancaster County did not accept the modification. Cherry Hill Lane, where Rebecca Stoltzfus had lived since her marriage in 1953 at the age of 18 to a young thresher named Daniel Stoltzfus, lay within District 6 of the Southern Lancaster Fellowship, and District 6 had voted unanimously in the Autumn Council of 1965 to retain the original Ordnung restriction against any owned or operated electrical apparatus on the home farmstead, including the diesel-driven milk tank exemption that 6 of the other Lancaster County districts had by then accepted. The vote had been recorded in the district minutes by a deacon named Christian Byler, whose handwritten entry in the leather-bound District 6 ledger remains the earliest documentary trace of the position that Rebecca Stoltzfus would 6 years later take to its quiet and unyielding conclusion. In October of 1971, on an 80-acre rolling hillside 3 miles east of Burdenham, Pennsylvania, a 36-year-old Old Order Amish widow named Rebecca Stoltzfus paid $360 in cash for 6 mature brown Swiss cows, 2 yearling brown Swiss heifers, and 1 brown Swiss bull from an elderly Lebanon County brown Swiss breeder named Aldous Utsi, who had been carrying the foundation lines of the Bender family brown Swiss herd continuously since 1936 on a 60-acre farmstead outside Myerstown. The 9 animals were the entire working surplus from Aldous Utsi's autumn 1971 herd assessment. Aldous Utsi had offered them to Rebecca Stoltzfus on the morning of the second Tuesday in September of 1971, 3 days after he had received the diagnosis from a Lebanon County doctor named Reuben Pfluger that the slow advance of his rheumatoid joint disease would within the calendar year prevent him from continuing the twice-daily hand-milking that the Bender bloodline herd had required without interruption, since his father, Heinrich Utsi, had received the foundation stock from a Berks County importer in the spring of 1936. Rebecca Stoltzfus was the daughter of a farrier named Levi Byler of Strasburg, Pennsylvania, and the widow of a thresher named Daniel Stoltzfus, who had been killed by a falling black walnut limb on the morning of the 21st of February 1969 while clearing a wind-thrown timber along the back fence line of the Cherry Hill farmstead. She had been left in the spring of that year with 2 children, a 14-year-old daughter named Mary Stoltzfus and a 10-year-old son named Aaron Stoltzfus, with the inherited Cherry Hill farmstead of 80 acres along the lower slope of Cherry Hill Mountain, with 1 team of Belgian draft horses, with a small flock of 15 heritage Buff Orpington hens, with 2 aging milking shorthorn cows already past their 4th lactation, and with the 1847 stone springhouse that her late husband's great-grandfather, Jonas Stoltzfus, had built into the south slope of the hillside in the 3rd year of his marriage to Susanna Stoltzfus. By the 2nd week of October 1971, Rebecca Stoltzfus had walked the 6 brown Swiss cows, the 2 yearling brown Swiss heifers, and the single brown Swiss bull, the 18 1/4 miles north from the Yahtzee farmstead in Lebanon County to the Cherry Hill farmstead in southern Lancaster County, sleeping overnight at the plain household of a second cousin named Mattie Esch in the village of Brickaville, and arriving at her own gate on the afternoon of October 16, 1971, with the lead cow on a plain rope and the rest of the small herd following the open south road in the manner that the Bender family had taught for 3 generations. The 1847 stone springhouse, which had not held butter or cream for the 14 years preceding her marriage, had stood largely unused along the south slope of the hillside, its dark green wooden door warped by humidity, its interior oak shelves dusted by spider webs, its stone water trough still fed by the same continuously running artesian spring that the Stoltzfus family surveyors of 1847 had measured at 52 degrees Fahrenheit year-round and at a flow rate of 12 gallons per minute. Rebecca Stoltzfus spent the entire winter of 1971 through 1972 restoring the spring house. She replaced the warped door with a new dark green door of clear heartwood white oak hand, planed by an old order carpenter named Stephen Lapp of Intercourse, Pennsylvania. Reset the interior oak shelves in 3 tiers, replaced the inner stone trough with a wider trough of cut and fitted local limestone from a Honeybrook quarry, and obtained from her late husband's elderly aunt, Lavina Stoltzfus, the 8 maple butter molds that Susanna Stoltzfus had carved from a single block of Quebec sugar maple in the autumn of 1898 in preparation for the marriage of her own daughter to a Mifflin County farmer. The molds had been used continuously by 4 generations of Stoltzfus women, had been signed on the underside of each mold with the carver's initials and the year of carving, and had not pressed a pound of butter since the death of Rebecca's mother-in-law, Mary Stoltzfus, in the influenza autumn of 1957. By the 1st of April, 1972, the spring house was operational, and the first 6 shallow-tinned cream-rising pans had been delivered from a Lancaster tinsmith named Henry Aby. The Oak Dasher churn, a 15-gallon vertical barrel churn of red oak staves bound with 3 copper hoops and fitted with a hand-carved white oak dasher of the cross-arm pattern that the older plain butter makers of the Lancaster Fellowship had used for at least 4 generations, had been obtained from the eldest brother of Rebecca Stoltzfus's late husband, a plain carpenter named Amos Stoltzfus, of the Upper Beechdale Road, who had kept the churn in his own dry storage barn since the death of his mother, Mary Stoltzfus, in 1957. Amos Stoltzfus, then 62 years of age in 1971, had himself been taught the use of the dasher churn by his mother Mary in the early 1920s and had retained the churn intact through the long years of its disuse without any modification of the original oak staves, the original copper hoops, or the original cross-arm white oak dasher. Rebecca Stoltzfus accepted the churn from her brother-in-law on the morning of the 18th of February 1972, sealed the staves with 3 coats of pure beeswax obtained through the same Lancaster hardware supplier who had been carrying beeswax for the plain butter makers of the Southern Lancaster Fellowship continuously since 1904, and tested the churn through 3 successive empty water spin trials on the 2nd of March, 1972, before the first trial cream churn of the 17th of March, 1972. The trial churn of the 17th of March, 1972, used the cream skimmed from the morning milking of the two aging milking shorthorn cows that Rebecca Stoltzfus had inherited from her late husband. The two cows then in their fifth and sixth lactations respectively, and producing only a combined daily yield of 14 3/4 pounds of milk per cow. The trial yielded 2 pounds and 3 ounces of finished butter pressed in 2 of the Susanna Stoltzfus maple molds. The trial was the first pound of butter pressed in the 1847 springhouse in 14 years and 6 weeks. The news that the widow on Cherry Hill Lane had taken on a small brown Swiss herd, that she had restored the old 1847 spring house, that she had refused even the diesel-driven milk tank exemption already accepted by 6 of the 8 Lancaster County districts, and that she intended to sell her butter directly into the English market without any intermediate cooperative oversight, reached the Lebanon County Dairy Cooperative on the morning of the 11th of April, 1972, by way of a Lebanon County feed mill clerk named Oscar Bertolet, who had taken her oat and salt order at the counter of the Bertolet Brothers feed mill in northern Lebanon County the previous afternoon. The news reached the Old Order Amish settlement of southern Lancaster County by way of 3 separate informal conversations carried during the noon meal of the second Sunday after Easter, 1972, at 3 different plain households along Cherry Hill Lane, Old Mill Road, and the lower stretch of the Beechdale Road. The plain community processed the news with the slowness and the deliberation that have always characterized the internal information transfer of an old order settlement, where written notice is generally limited to district matters, and where verbal report is filtered through the bishop, the deacon, and the senior household elders before it acquires the standing of accepted settlement record. By the end of April 1972, the news had reached Bishop Eli Lapp of District 6. By the second week of May 1972, the news had reached the 4 senior elders of District 6. By the third week of May 1972, the 4 senior elders of District 6 had requested that the bishop call a special advisory council in the front meeting room of the Daniel King farmhouse on the Upper Beechdale Road, the meeting to take place on the evening of the 3rd of June, 1972, the agenda to consider whether the widow Rebecca Stoltzfus had moved outside the acceptable margin of the District 6 Ordnung in her conduct of an unsupervised direct-to-English dairy sale operation from the Cherry Hill farmstead. The bishop, after consulting in private with the deacon Christian Beeler, agreed to the meeting. On the evening of the 3rd of June, 1972, 4 old order Amish men in their 60s and 70s, all 4 with the full untrimmed silver and white chest-length beards of married plain men, and the plain black flat-crowned straw hats of the Southern Lancaster Fellowship, gathered in the front meeting room of the Daniel King farmhouse on the Upper Beechdale Road. Bishop Eli Lapp, then 68 years of age, sat at the head of the long pine table. The deacon Christian Byler, then 62 years of age, sat at his right. The senior elders Jacob Mast, 65, and Levi Glick, 71, sat across from each other. The discussion lasted 3 hours and 20 minutes. Bishop Eli Lapp, whose handwritten entry in the District 6 ledger summarizing the discussion remains the only documentary trace of the meeting, recorded the position of the senior elders in language that, translated from the original Pennsylvania German, may be rendered as the observation that the widow's refusal of the diesel-driven cooling exemption was within the strict letter of the District 6 Ordnung and could not be objected to on Ordnung grounds, but that her stated intention of selling butter directly to the English market without intermediate cooperative oversight constituted a departure from the customary practice of the settlement and ought to be either reconsidered by the widow or guided into a more acceptable arrangement by the bishop. The bishop, however, made no formal recommendation. The deacon Christian Byler noted in the ledger that the widow's refusal of the diesel exemption represented in fact an unusually strict observance of the original Ordnung position, and that to instruct her to depart from that strict observance would constitute a strange and contradictory action for a council whose own founding ledger entry had defended that same strict observance 7 years earlier. The senior elder, Levi Glick, the only member of the council whose Pennsylvania German notes from the evening survive, observed that the customary practice of the settlement was not itself the Ordnung, and that the customary practice of the settlement was permitted to contain within it the work of women whose hands had carried the older method through times when the customary practice had drifted toward the cooperative. The meeting ended without resolution. The senior elders left the Daniel King farmhouse unsatisfied. The English Dairy Cooperative men of Lebanon County, who had heard within the week the report of the unresolved June 3rd meeting, took the unresolved status as license to begin the long open laughter that would last 7 years. The laughter that began at the counter of the Lebanon County Dairy Company operative in the second week of June 1972 was carried into the morning coffee routine of the Bertolet Brothers feed mill, then into the afternoon coffee routine of the Myerstown Diner on the corner of Main and Railroad Street in northern Lebanon County, and then into the Friday evening telephone routine of 4 English commercial dairy farmers, whose names and dispositions the chroniclers of this story have since recorded. The 4 were Cyrus Donahue, then 58 years of age, the operator of a 140-cow Holstein Friesian dairy on the Stricklerstown Road; Vernon Strickler, then 54 years of age, the operator of a 120-cow Holstein Friesian dairy on the same road; Owen Bauman, then 61 years of age, the operator of an 80-cow Holstein Friesian dairy on the Mount Zion Road; and Earl Lutz, then 49 years of age, the operator of a 60-cow Holstein Friesian dairy on the Schaefferstown Road. All 4 had signed on to the cooperative bulk pickup contract in the consolidation year of 1947. All 4 had installed compressor-driven bulk tanks in the early 1950s. All 4 had switched to artificial insemination of registered Holstein Friesian bulls by 1963. All 4 had, on the morning of the 11th of April 1972, laughed openly at the Bertolet feed mill counter when Oscar Bertolet had read aloud the order from the widow on Cherry Hill Lane for 80 pounds of crushed oats and 2 pounds of Cape Cod sea salt, and all 4 had, on the morning of the 14th of April, 1972, repeated the laughter at the counter of the Myerstown Diner, with the addition of the observation, reported in the diner waitress's private notebook in the form of the phrase that the widow on Cherry Hill Lane was going to learn the cooling chemistry of the modern dairy the hard and bacterial way. The laughter, recorded variously by 4 different witnesses in the spring of 1972, was not cruel in its tone. It was the laughter of men whose professional certainty had been built on a quarter century of cooperative bulk pickup performance, and who could not conceive of an alternative cooling system reaching the centralized creamery's required 42-degree Fahrenheit threshold. The laughter spread through the dairy circuit of Lebanon and northern Lancaster County by the end of May 1972. What happened next in the small spring house on the south slope of the Cherry Hill farmstead between the April of 1972 and the January of 1978 was not recorded by any cooperative dispatcher, was not weighed by any state dairy inspector, was not photographed by any agricultural extension agent, and was not contained in any newspaper of record east of the Susquehanna River until the writer Adelaide Peton of the Philadelphia Inquirer drove the 79 miles west from her apartment on Locust Street to the gate of the Cherry Hill farmstead on the morning of the 23rd of October, 1977. What has since been recovered of the 6-year quiet period of Rebecca Stoltzfus's work has been pieced together from 3 separate sources, the first being the surviving daily butter-making ledger of Rebecca Stoltzfus herself, the second being the surviving order sheet records of Henry Abey of Lancaster, who continued to supply her shallow tin cream rising pans on a yearly basis, and the third being the surviving correspondence between Rebecca Stoltzfus and a Wanamaker's Philadelphia department store butter buyer named Gilbert Whitcomb, who first wrote to Cherry Hill Lane in the autumn of 1976. We are working through these 3 ledgers and 3 correspondence files, one entry at a time. The daily butter-making ledger of Rebecca Stoltzfus, a leather-bound octavo volume of 242 pages, whose entries cover the period from the 3rd of April, 1972, through the 31st of December, 1977, records in its first entries the milk yield of each of the 6 original brown Swiss cows by the half-pound, the cream rise time in hours and quarter hours after each milking, the butter churn time in minutes and quarter minutes for each batch, the salt weight in ounces and quarter ounces for each pressing, the press time in minutes for each mold filling, and the spring house cooling time in hours for each finished pound. The first entry, on the 3rd of April, 1972, records a cream rise time of 24 1/4 hours, a churn time of 47 minutes, a salt weight of 3/8 of an ounce per pound, a press time of 9 minutes, and a spring house cooling time of 7 hours, yielding a first batch of 6 pounds and 4 ounces of finished butter. The 17th entry, on the 7th of May, 1972, records the first appearance of a slow yellow color in the cream rise, the appearance that the older plain butter makers had long associated with the entry of late spring pasture clover into the brown Swiss diet. The 32nd entry, on the 11th of June, 1972, records the first sale of butter into the English market, 4 pounds sold for $1.25 per pound to a Lancaster City restaurant called the Watt and Shand Tea Room. The 41st entry, on the 23rd of July, 1972, records the addition of 3 additional brown Swiss cows purchased from a second brown Swiss breeder in northern Berks County named Amos Brubaker. The 57th entry, on the 14th of September, 1972, records the first repeat order from the Watt and Shand Tea Room, The 73rd entry, on the 11th of November 1972, records the first inquiry letter from the raiding terminal market dairy buyer Eugene Yarnall. The ledger continues, page after page, line after line, through the long, quiet years. The 89th entry, on the 2nd of February 1973, records the first pound of cultured butter, produced using a small portion of returned whey held overnight at springhouse temperature. The 107th entry, on the 23rd of April 1973, records the first standing weekly order from the Reading Terminal Market, the order placed at 6 pounds per week. The 122nd entry, on the 11th of June 1973, records the first calf, born of the original brown Swiss herd at the Cherry Hill farmstead. The 144th entry, on the 29th of August 1973, records the first batch produced using the new shallow-tinned cream-rising pans of 2 1/2 inches depth, the new pans being delivered by Henry Aby of Lancaster on the 23rd of August 1973. The 191st entry, on the 7th of February 1974, records the morning the springhouse water trough was found to have frozen at the surface for the first time since restoration. The freeze recorded as 1/4 inch of surface ice, and the spring water below the ice still measured at 52 degrees Fahrenheit. The 217th entry, on the 3rd of May 1974, records the entry of the first brown Swiss heifer, born at the Cherry Hill farmstead, into the working dairy line. The 243rd entry, on the 11th of August 1974, records the first standing account with Eugene Yarnall. The 274th entry, on the 3rd of November 1974, records the first cold weather adjustment to the cream rise time. The 302nd entry, on the 2nd of February 1975, records the first written correspondence to the Cherry Hill farmstead from outside the Lebanon and Lancaster corridor. The correspondence being a letter from a small specialty grocery operator named Theodore Bachman of the German Village neighborhood of Baltimore. The 329th entry, on the 11th of May 1975, records the first delivery of butter to the German Village specialty grocery. The 371st entry, on the 18th of October 1975, records the first sale to a Philadelphia restaurant intermediary. The 412th entry, on the 3rd of March 1976, records the first inquiry letter from the Wanamaker's Philadelphia department store dairy buyer Gilbert Whitcomb. The 438th entry, on the 27th of June 1976, records the morning the Lancaster City restaurant buyer arrived at the Cherry Hill gate with the tripled standing order. By the spring of 1974, Rebecca Stoltzfus's small brown Swiss herd had grown from the original 9 animals to 17, the additions consisting of 3 cows purchased from Amos Brubaker in northern Berks County, 2 cows born on her own farmstead from the original 6 bred to the original bull, and 3 yearling heifers purchased from a 3rd brown Swiss breeder in southern Schuylkill County, named Daniel Hartranft. The spring house, which had been originally fitted with 3 tiers of oak shelves and a single limestone water trough, had been extended in the late autumn of 1973 by the addition of a second limestone water trough, cut and fitted by the same Honeybrook quarry that had supplied the first, and the spring flow which the Stoltzfus surveyors of 1847 had measured at 12 gallons per minute had proved more than adequate for the doubled cooling capacity. The cream rise had been refined by the introduction of a second size of shallow tinned pan, 2½ inches deep rather than the original 3 inches, supplied again by Henry Eby of Lancaster and used in the warmer months to shorten the rise time by approximately 3½ hours and to reduce the small bacterial drift that the older plain butter makers had long associated with the deeper pan in the hot months of late July and August. The butter molds, originally limited to the 8 Susanna Stoltzfus carved maple molds of 1898, had been supplemented in the spring of 1973 by the addition of 4 further maple molds of identical pattern, carved by the Lancaster carpenter Stephen Lapp from Quebec sugar maple obtained at Rebecca Stoltzfus's specific request. The new molds, signed on the underside in the manner of the older molds, and the pattern faithfully copied from the older molds without any modification. By the spring of 1975, the daily output of the Cherry Hill Farmstead Springhouse had reached 44 pounds of finished butter. By the spring of 1976, the daily output had reached 58 pounds. The English market for the butter had grown by the same period from the single Lancaster City restaurant of 1972 to 14 separate English market accounts running from Lancaster City to Reading to Philadelphia to a small specialty grocery in Baltimore. In the early summer of 1976, the Lebanon County Dairy Cooperative Central Creamery at Mannheim received from the Pennsylvania State University Department of Dairy Science Microbiological Laboratory at University Park the test results of a routine bulk tank sampling that had been conducted on the milk pickups of the second Thursday in May 1976. The test results indicated the presence of an elevated psychotrophic bacterial count in the bulk tank milk of 14 separate farms in the cooperative pickup district. The 14 farms included the dairies of Cyrus Donahue, Vernon Strickler, Owen Bauman, and Earl Lutz. The elevated psychotrophic count, while not in itself a public health emergency, indicated a slow cooling failure in the bulk tank apparatus of all 14 farms, a failure that the cooperative microbiologist Wayne Heisey identified in his report to the Central Creamery Board as consistent with the slow degradation of the compressor unit refrigerant gas in 14 separately installed bulk tanks of similar manufacture and similar installation year. The Cooperative Board reviewed the report in the second week of June 1976. The Cooperative Board notified the 14 farms in the third week of June 1976. The 14 farms were instructed to either replace the compressor units of their bulk tanks within 90 days at an average cost of $720 per unit, or to discontinue cooperative pickup. The 14 farms entered the dairy crisis of 1976. The Lebanon County Dairy Cooperative was forced to halt pickups on the 14 affected farms for the better part of 7 weeks. The news of the bulk tank failure reached the southern Lancaster County Old Order Amish settlement by the second Sunday after the Summer Council of 1976. The news reached Cherry Hill Lane by way of a Lancaster City restaurant buyer, who arrived at Rebecca Stoltzfus's gate on the morning of the 27th of June 1976 with an order for 90 pounds of butter per week, 3 times his previous standing order. The Pennsylvania State University microbiologist Wayne Heisey, in his subsequent report to the Cooperative Central Creamery Board, dated the 11th of August, 1976, observed that the slow degradation of the compressor unit refrigerant gas across the 14 affected bulk tanks had advanced over a period of approximately 22 months and would not have been detectable by the routine visual and temperature inspections that the cooperative dispatcher conducted on the morning pickup runs. Heisey further observed in the report that the elevated psychrotropic counts in the affected bulk tank samples were consistent with bulk tank surface cooling temperatures in the range of 43 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 to 5 degrees above the cooperative pickup acceptance threshold, and that the slow drift in cooling performance had been masked by the cooperative dispatcher's customary practice of recording bulk tank temperatures at the bottom of the tank below the cream layer rather than at the surface. The implications of the Heisey report extended beyond the immediate 14 affected farms and prompted the Lebanon County Dairy Cooperative Central Creamery Board to commission, in the autumn of 1976, a full audit of all 147 bulk tank installations in the cooperative pickup district. The audit identified 17 further bulk tank installations with compressor units in the late stage of refrigerant degradation. The audit, completed in the second week of December 1976, was not publicly released, but its findings circulated through the Eastern Pennsylvania dairy press throughout the calendar year 1977 and contributed to the slow but accelerating English market interest in farmstead butter that would eventually reach the Cherry Hill Springhouse through the intermediary of Adelaide Peton of the Philadelphia Inquirer. The Lebanon County dairy crisis of 1976 did not destroy the 4 English commercial dairies of Cyrus Donahue, Vernon Strickler, Owen Bauman, and Earl Lutz, but it forced upon each of the 4 operators a substantial unanticipated capital outlay during a calendar quarter in which the Holstein-Friesian milk price had already fallen by 11% against the previous year. Cyrus Donahue financed the replacement of his compressor unit through a 1-year operating loan from the Lebanon Production Credit Association. Vernon Strickler sold 32 of his 120 Holstein-Friesian cows at the Bart Livestock Auction in the first week of August 1976 to cover the cost. Owen Bauman applied for and received an emergency operating loan from the Farm Credit Bank of Baltimore. Earl Lutz, the youngest of the 4 and the most exposed by the price decline, was forced to discontinue cooperative pickup entirely for the remainder of 1976 and to sell his entire 60-cow Holstein-Friesian herd at the Bart auction in the second week of October 1976. The Lebanon County Dairy Cooperative Central Creamery at Mannheim, meanwhile, lost approximately 420,000 pounds of butterfat production during the 7-week pickup halt. The English market for high-quality table butter in eastern Pennsylvania, which had been supplied for a quarter century by the centralized creamery production of the Lebanon and Lancaster cooperatives, experienced for the first time since 1947 a sustained shortage of supply at the retail level. The Reading Terminal Market dairy stalls reported the first week of June 1976, selling completely through their cooperative butter inventory by Wednesday morning. The Philadelphia retail grocery chain Acme Markets reported its central commissary at Malvern temporarily out of stock of all branded butter by the second week of July 1976. The shortage drove a small but growing trade in farmstead butter, the small quantities still produced by remaining independent dairy operations in the southern Pennsylvania corridor. On the morning of the 23rd of October, 1977, the Philadelphia Inquirer food writer Adelaide Peton drove the 79 miles west from her apartment on Locust Street in Philadelphia to the Farmstead Gate on Cherry Hill Lane in a 1973 Plymouth Valiant station wagon. She had been informed of the existence of the Cherry Hill springhouse butter by way of 3 separate sources, the first being the Reading Terminal Market dairy buyer, Eugene Yarnall, who had taken delivery of his standing order from the Cherry Hill farmstead every Tuesday since the early autumn of 1972. The second being the Wanamaker's Philadelphia department store butter buyer, Gilbert Whitcomb, who had been receiving correspondence from Rebecca Stoltzfus since the autumn of 1976 and who had begun taking delivery on a regular basis in February of 1977. And the third being a Philadelphia restaurant chef named Lucien Brassard, who had received samples of the Cherry Hill butter in the spring of 1977 through the Wanamaker's intermediary, and who had begun a standing weekly order in the summer of 1977. Adelaide Pemberton, then 43 years of age, a graduate of Bryn Mawr College in 1956, and a food writer at the Inquirer since 1962, had specifically been told by the Wanamaker's buyer that the maker of the butter was an old-order Amish widow operating without electrical refrigeration of any kind, using a stone spring house and an oak dasher churn and a set of inherited 1898 maple molds, and selling butter that had registered consistently lower psychotrophic bacterial counts in independent laboratory testing than the cooperative creamery production of the entire Lebanon-Lancaster corridor. Adelaide Pemberton spent 4 full days at the Cherry Hill farmstead, sleeping at the plain household of the bishop's deacon Christian Byler's wife, Anna Byler, observing the morning and evening milking of the now 23 brown Swiss cows, observing the cream rise in the shallow tinned pans, observing the churning in the oak dasher churn, observing the pressing in the 1898 Susanna Stoltzfus maple molds, and writing her notes in a small spiral pocket notebook with the careful hand of a Bryn Mawr trained ethnographer. Her 3,200-word feature article appeared in the Sunday Inquirer of the 13th of November, 1977. The 4-day visit of Adelaide Pemberton to the Cherry Hill farmstead between the 23rd and the 27th of October 1977 produced for the Inquirer feature article a corpus of field notes that the writer would later describe as the most thoroughly observed piece of agricultural reporting she would conduct in her 31-year career. Adelaide Pemberton recorded in her spiral pocket notebook the timing of the morning milking at 4:37 a.m. on the morning of the 24th of October, 1977, the timing of the cream skim at 6:12 a.m. That same morning, the pH of the morning cream skim measured by a small handheld pH meter she had brought from Philadelphia at 6.74. The temperature of the springhouse water trough at 52.1 degrees Fahrenheit. The dimensions of the limestone water trough at 4 feet 6 inches in length by 1 foot 11 inches in width by 8 inches in depth. The count of the maple butter molds in their proper storage row at 12. The count of finished butter pounds in their stoneware crocks at 62. And the names spoken by Rebecca Stoltzfus in the 4 days of observation including the names of the original 6 brown Swiss cows that the older plain women of the Lancaster Fellowship had always assigned to the lead animals of a working dairy herd. Adelaide Pemberton's 3,200-word Inquirer feature article carried in its central section a description of the cream rise process that she would later say had been the most difficult 3 paragraphs of her career to write, because the process resisted, in its quietness and its unhurried duration, any rendering into the journalistic prose of an English Sunday food page. The 13th of November, 1977 Sunday Inquirer feature article by Adelaide Pemberton, titled in the original Inquirer composition simply "The Springhouse on Cherry Hill," was reprinted in syndicated form by the Knight Ridder newspaper chain in the second week of November 1977, appearing in the Detroit Free Press, the Miami Herald, the Akron Beacon Journal, the Charlotte Observer, the Wichita Eagle, and 15 further Knight Ridder City dailies between the 13th and the 27th of November, 1977. The article generated for the Cherry Hill farmstead, within the 8 weeks following its first appearance, 864 pieces of correspondence, 14 further standing order inquiries from English dairy buyers in Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, and New York City, 3 feature article inquiries from other East Coast newspapers, 2 photograph inquiries from the editorial board of Mother Earth News, and 1 telephone inquiry from the office of the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture in Harrisburg regarding the eligibility of the Cherry Hill Springhouse butter for entry into the 1978 Pennsylvania Farm Show Dairy Products Exhibition. The inquiry from the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture was received by way of a letter delivered to the Cherry Hill Farmstead mailbox on the 8th of December, 1977, and answered on the 11th of December, 1977, through the intermediary correspondence handling of Adelaide Pemberton, who had by then established a working professional relationship with Rebecca Stoltz-Foos. The Pennsylvania Farm Show Dairy Products Exhibition Committee, after reviewing the 3-pound entry sample sent under refrigerated packing to the Pennsylvania State University Department of Dairy Science Laboratory for psychotrophic bacterial count and standard butterfat composition analysis, accepted the entry of the Cherry Hill Springhouse butter into the farmstead cultured butter category of the 1978 Pennsylvania Farm Show on the 17th of December, 1977. The laboratory bacterial count of the Cherry Hill sample, completed on the 15th of December, 1977 by the microbiologist Wayne Heisey, the same Pennsylvania state microbiologist who had identified the Lebanon County compressor failure of the previous year, was the lowest psychotrophic count Heisey had recorded on any farmstead butter sample submitted to the laboratory, since the records had been formally maintained starting in the calendar year 1968. The Cherry Hill Daily Buttermaking Ledger for the calendar year 1976 contained 457 entries between the 1st of January and the 31st of December, the entries averaging in their length approximately 10 lines of handwritten record per entry and recording across the calendar year a total finished butter output of 14,241 pounds. The annual output represented an increase of approximately 21% over the calendar year 1975, a growth that Rebecca Stoltz-Foos had managed without the addition of any further brown Swiss cows beyond the 4 cows born of the Cherry Hill herd in the calving season of 1976, and without the addition of any further equipment beyond a second limestone water trough, cut and fitted by the Honeybrook Quarry in the spring of 1976. The annual output for the calendar year 1977, the calendar year of the Adelaide Pemberton feature article, and the year of the first sustained English market interest in the Cherry Hill butter, reached 17,894 pounds, an increase of approximately 26% over the previous calendar year. The annual output for the calendar year 1978, the year of the Pennsylvania Farm Show gold medal, reached 21,142 pounds. The working ceiling of what a single small brown Swiss herd at the Cherry Hill farmstead could produce under the strict observance of the 1847 springhouse cooling method. The 4 English commercial dairy operators of Lebanon County, whose open laughter in the spring of 1972 had crossed the Bertollet feed mill counter and the Myerstown diner coffee routine and the Friday evening telephone routine of the cooperative pickup district, arrived at the gate of the Cherry Hill farmstead on 4 separate occasions between the 18th of November 1977 and the 12th of January 1978. The first to arrive on the 18th of November 1977 was the youngest of the 4, the operator of the discontinued 60-cow Holstein Friesian dairy on the Schaefferstown Road, who had read the Sunday Inquirer feature article in the Allentown Morning Call reprint, and who arrived with a hand-delivered letter of inquiry concerning the possibility of contract supply of brown Swiss cream to the Cherry Hill Springhouse. Rebecca Stoltzfus declined the contract supply. The second to arrive, on the 2nd of December 1977, was the operator of the 80-cow Holstein Friesian dairy on the Mount Zion Road, who arrived with a similar contract inquiry. Rebecca Stoltzfus declined. The third to arrive, on the 18th of December 1977, was the operator of the 120-cow Holstein Friesian dairy on the Stricklerstown Road, who arrived with a contract inquiry of larger scale. Rebecca Stoltzfus declined. The fourth to arrive, on the 12th of January 1978, 5 days before the opening of the 1978 Pennsylvania Farm Show, was the eldest of the 4, the operator of the 140-cow Holstein Friesian dairy on the Stricklerstown Road. He arrived alone, on foot, having walked the last 2 1/4 miles from the farm gate of his cousin Otis Donahue on the Lower Beechdale Road, and he carried in his right hand a small square of folded paper containing a handwritten note. The handwritten note, the original of which has since been preserved in the Cherry Hill correspondence file, contained the 4-word Pennsylvania English phrase that I was wrong. Rebecca Stoltzfus accepted the note. She did not return a written reply. The plain settlement of southern Lancaster County does not gloat. The 4 English dairy operators of Lebanon County returned to their farms and to their reconstituted bulk tank operations, and to the slow recovery of the cooperative pickup arrangement under the new compressor units installed in the late winter of 1977. The 4 English commercial dairy operators of Lebanon County, who arrived at the Cherry Hill gate between the 18th of November 1977 and the 12th of January 1978, did not arrive together and did not coordinate their arrivals. The first 3 arrivals carried with them written letters of inquiry concerning contract supply arrangements. The 4th arrival, the operator of the largest of the 4 Holstein Friesian dairies, arrived without a written inquiry and stood for 9 minutes at the closed farm gate before placing the hand-written note that I was wrong into the small wooden mailbox that Rebecca Stoltzfus had nailed to the fence post in the spring of 1973. Rebecca Stoltzfus retrieved the note that afternoon at the conclusion of the evening milking, read it once, folded it into thirds, placed it inside the leather-bound daily butter-making ledger between the entries for the 11th and the 12th of January 1978, and continued the recording of the daily output without further comment. On the morning of the 17th of January 1978, in the Great Hall of the Pennsylvania State Farm Show Complex at Harrisburg, the judging panel of the Pennsylvania Farm Show Dairy Products Exhibition convened at the long judging table at the western end of the hall, under the high painted iron truss roof of the Agricultural Exhibition Wing. The panel, consisting of 7 judges drawn from the Pennsylvania State University Department of Dairy Science, the United States Department of Agriculture Agricultural Research Service Laboratory at Beltsville, Maryland, the Wisconsin Center for Dairy Research at Madison, and 3 private Pennsylvania farmstead dairy operators of long professional standing. The farmstead cultured butter category, the smallest category of the dairy products exhibition, and the category that the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture had introduced only in the calendar year 1969 for the explicit purpose of preserving competitive recognition of farmstead butter making in an era of accelerating cooperative consolidation, contained in its 1978 calendar year entries a total of 31 submissions from across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The judging panel scored each of the 31 entries on a 30-point composite scale across the categories of color, body texture, salt distribution, flavor profile, aroma profile, salt level, and microbiological purity. The panel completed its scoring on the afternoon of the 17th of January, 1978. The Cherry Hill Springhouse butter entry, submitted under the entry number Lancaster 621 and accompanied by no maker biography, no farm photograph, and no marketing material whatsoever, received the highest composite score of any farmstead cultured butter entry submitted to the Pennsylvania Farm Show Dairy Products Exhibition in the entire 11-year history of the farmstead cultured butter category. The gold medal was announced at the public award ceremony on the evening of the 18th of January 1978 in the Central Hall of the Farm Show Complex. Rebecca Stoltzfus was not present at the ceremony. Adelaide Peton accepted the gold medal on her behalf and carried it the next morning to the Cherry Hill farmstead in the same 1973 Plymouth Valiant station wagon. The Plain settlement of southern Lancaster County received the news through the Deacon Christian Byler on the second Sunday after the award ceremony. The senior elders of District 6 acknowledged the gold medal in the leather-bound District 6 ledger in a brief entry dated the 29th of January 1978. In a small back kitchen of the Cherry Hill farmhouse, on a worn pine porch chair, in the spring afternoon of the year 1947, an elderly plain woman in a full white apron and a heart-shaped Lancaster prayer cap sat watching her great-granddaughter, Rebecca Byler, then 12 years of age, lower a single drop of separated cream into a shallow tinned pan of still spring water. The elderly woman was Susanna Stoltzfus, then 81 years of age, the wife of the long-deceased Jonas Stoltzfus, who had built the 1847 springhouse into the south slope of the hillside, the mother of Mary Stoltzfus, who had carved the maple butter molds in the autumn of 1898, the grandmother of Daniel Stoltzfus, who would in the spring of 1953 marry the young farrier's daughter from Strasbourg, and the great-grandmother of Rebecca Byler, who would in the autumn of 1971 walk the 18 miles north to the Ute farmstead in Lebanon County to purchase the foundation of the herd. Susanna Stoltzfus had taught the cream rise test to her own daughter Mary in the year 1898 on the same back kitchen porch. She had been taught the cream rise test by her own grandmother Magdalena Lapierre on a Quebec farmhouse porch in the year of the Great Frost, 1874. The cream rise test, as Susanna Stoltzfus performed it on the porch of the Cherry Hill farmhouse in the spring afternoon of 1947 for the instruction of her great-granddaughter, consisted of lowering a single drop of separated cream from the height of 3 inches into a shallow-tinned pan of still cold spring water, observing the soundless drop, observing the small white circle of cream resting on the surface of the water, and waiting through a count of 12 for the slow downward dispersion of the butterfat globules into the column of water below. If the dispersion was slow, the cream was ready for the churn. If the dispersion was fast, the cream was not yet ready. Susanna Stoltzfus, watching her great-granddaughter perform the test for the first time, observed that the cream was not yet ready, and that the young Rebecca was to wait 3 hours longer. She also observed in the Pennsylvania German that her great-granddaughter would carry forward for the rest of her own life, that the day would come when the English market was ready for real butter, that on that day the plain settlements would still be here, and that the small spring houses along the south slope of the hillside would still be cool. If you have ever raised an animal everybody told you was the wrong one for your county, leave a comment below telling us what it was. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe and ring the bell. There is one of these stories in every county in America. We are working through them, one harvest at a time.